no class on loneliness in medical school. It was not really part of our curricula to think about how to ask people deeply about their social connections. So I felt out of my league in a sense, that I was encountering problems that I frankly had no idea how to solve, but they seemed important because they kept coming up and they seemed to fill people with sadness.
I would love to ask you about several facets of what you just shared. The first is being the only person, or along with your colleagues, the only people with someone who is going to die or who is in palliative care. I suppose those are synonymous, or who has just been given a very grave diagnosis. I've found you over the last handful of years to be very calm, very soothing, and I'd be curious to know what you did in those circumstances to help these people psychologically. What types of things would you say? What would you do? Are there any particular examples that spring to mind that were difficult? I'd love to just, if you're open to it, talk about really any specific example that jumps to mind, because that strikes me as a potentially difficult circumstance to navigate. And I don't know how long these people were in the hospital, but it's possible that they'd been alone or felt alone for a long time, and really the strongest tether they had at the time of the diagnosis or before passing would be with you or one of your colleagues. So I'd just be very interested to hear you speak to that.
Yeah, those moments, Tim, are still so deeply etched in my memory, because they impacted me a great deal as well. But in those moments, as a doctor, you're trained to use your head and your heart. But I found in those moments in particular that I had to get completely out of my head and just try to fully inhabit my heart and be there not as a doctor, but as a human being. And I do think that all of us, regardless of what stage of life we're at, we've got three basic needs. We all want to know that we matter. We want to be seen for who we are, and we want to know that we're loved. And in those moments, what I tried my best to do was to help people feel that they were seen, just simply by sitting there and focusing on them and listening to them, by putting my pager aside, by not standing at the doorway, but actually pulling up a chair and sitting with them, by holding their hand. Often, the physical contact is such an important part of our human connection. And I tried to just listen to whatever it was that they wanted to talk about. And there were times where I struggled. I felt like, maybe I should say something insightful or thoughtful or empathic. But when I look back on those conversations, I think the most important part was just showing up and being there and being fully present. So that's what I tried to do. And, I had this ritual that I would do also, like when they passed, which is, when a patient passes away, you're always called as a doctor to pronounce them. And so you have to document that the heart has stopped, that there's no corneal reflex. And there are a series of steps that you have to take like that. And so I would do that, but I would also then take a minute to just stand by their bedside in silence with them, and to just imagine sort of like the energy, of the universe just washing over them, with love and with kindness. And that was my special moment with them. And even though they passed, I would hope that it was meaningful for their spirit. It was certainly meaningful for me. But those are some of the things that I would try to do at the end of life. I don't know if they mattered or made a huge difference in people's lives, but I hope that it may have eased the pain of their passing just a little bit.
Thank you for sharing that. How do you think about your own mortality or relate to mortality? And I don't mean to take this in a metaphysical or esoteric direction, but as someone who has witnessed a fair amount of death and no doubt thought about the finite time that you have on this planet, at least for now, how do you relate to mortality or think about it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think about my mortality often, not in a morbid way, but in a way that I hope will remind me to appreciate the present moment. When I was in residency training, I remember one week being on the oncology service where half of the patients I was taking care of were young people in their 20s who had end-stage gastric cancer. And I was in my 20s at the time. And it was really a stark experience for me because I could have been lying in that bed instead of them. Like, these were accidents of fate. And so there's something about training in medicine in those years and then caring for patients afterward that made me continually recommit to trying to be as present as I could, recognizing that, tomorrow is not guaranteed. We don't know how long we have with the people we love, but we can make choices today to dramatically improve the quality of our life and the depth of our happiness. And so when I think about my mortality, I try to think about being fully present now. I try to think after that, my residency training, I made a significant change, for example, in how I spent my leisure time. So I made it a point to try to come home to see my family in Miami every 2 to 3 months. Prior to that, I used to go about twice a year. And there's no right number of visits to make to one's family. But for me, I realized that I wanted to be there as often as I could for the people who had given everything so that I could live the life that I have. And to me, that was well worth it. And I look back on my life, and, we all look back on our life and we wonder if we made the right decisions. And I'm the same. I'm not always sure I made the right decisions on things. But in that one area, I feel like, yes, that was the right thing to do, to come see them more often. So, yeah, as a dad, it's a little different now also. I think about more mortality, and it's bittersweet because I think about the things I may miss if I'm not here in terms of my children's major milestones in life, their moments of great joy and happiness. I want them to find true love in life. I want to be there when that happens. I think about those moments, and with a tinge of sadness, I would be sad to not be there. But that makes me all the more want to live my life in a way where the time I'm spending right now is time well spent. I'm focused on relationships and focused on giving and receiving love.
There's a fantastic essay, if people listening have not read it, by Tim Urban called The Tail End, that I certainly recommend everybody read. That had the same impact on me in the sense that I ended up dramatically increasing the amount of time per year that I spent with parents in particular, and also my brother. If you don't mind, I'd love to zoom out just to provide some context and maybe define what the Surgeon General does. and I would love to hear you describe the role of the Surgeon General, and then how and why you ended up the Surgeon General.
Well, this is a good thing to talk about because I think very few people actually know what the Surgeon General does, even though many people know the position exists. And that frankly includes people in government who don't necessarily know what the Surgeon General does, even though they may have a working relationship with the office of the Surgeon General. So I'll tell you, when I actually became Surgeon General, it was a fascinating process, which I'm happy to talk about. But at very few, if any, points in all of the conversations I had with people in the administration did somebody sit down and say, okay, this is what your job will entail. So one of the first things I did when I became Surgeon General is I went to the General Counsel at the Department of Health and Human Services. And I said, look, I have a sense of what I want to do as Surgeon General, of what the job entails. But what I really want to know is, what does the law actually say about what my job is? Because everyone seems to have a different idea here. And so what the law says is it says that the job of the Surgeon General is to be the commanding officer overseeing the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps. So this is one of the uniformed services in the United States government, alongside the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the other uniformed services. And the officers in the Commission Corps are doctors and nurses and public health engineers and physical therapists and other health practitioners. But overseeing that service and serving as the Vice Admiral of that service is the statutory responsibility. But there's another responsibility that has evolved over time, which is that the Surgeon General is supposed to provide the public with the best possible information on health so people can make good decisions for themselves and their families. And that's taken on many forms. Some Surgeons General have published reports, and Surgeon General reports have become these iconic publications that spark major changes in policy and in practice all around the world. Others have taken to being out in the public often to issue PSAs and to talk to people directly about steps they can take to be healthier. But all of this comes down to the fact that the job itself is actually quite flexible. And that was one of the things that I certainly appreciated about it, is that unlike most other political appointees, your allegiance is not to the president. Your allegiance and your highest responsibility is to the public and to science. And I like that. So if there's a disagreement between what the president says and what science says, you're supposed to side with science, even if that puts you at risk of being fired. So I liked that. I liked being able to create your own agenda and being, sort of attuned to what the people want and being out there in communities across the country. That really spoke to me. It was exciting to me, and one of the reasons I ultimately felt the job was a good fit.
When would a listener, if ever, encounter one of these 6,000 plus public health officers who were under your command, so to speak, as Vice Admiral? I'm just wondering in what context we can imagine these people working. And I ask in part because I'm hearing currently, of course, this is late March, of the National Guard potentially building field hospitals and so on. So would they end up at a field hospital, or are they working exclusively in government and don't have contact with civilians? Could you describe what types of work that uniformed service of 6,000 plus do?
Yeah, so they do a variety of jobs throughout the federal government. So some are stationed at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. Some are at the Food and Drug Administration. Some are at NIH, the National Institutes of Health. So they are throughout the Department of Health and Human Services. But they also work at other agencies in government. They provide a lot of the health care in the Bureau of Prisoners to people who are incarcerated. They also work in the National Park Service to help guide the Department of Interior on matters related to health. When you may have encountered, so these are the people, just to keep in mind, who help build and preserve and execute the infrastructure for public health throughout the country. Where you may have encountered them are actually during times of crisis. So we deploy our officers to disaster areas when there's a major hurricane or a tornado that comes through or a major flood. After 9/11, we sent many officers to New York to help provide basic medical care and to help stand up the medical and public health infrastructure. When the Ebola crisis hit in the Obama administration, we sent hundreds of officers to Liberia to help open what was called the Monrovia Medical Unit and provide direct care to people there. And the reason we did that was because prior to setting up the Monrovia Medical Unit, countries around the world were not sending their volunteers to Liberia, even though the Ebola outbreak was ramping up at a really scary pace. But they weren't doing that because they were worried their volunteers would get sick and no one would be there to take care of them. But when we set up that unit, when these Commission Corps officers started caring for people, then countries opened the floodgates, knowing that if their volunteers got sick, someone would be there to care for them. So these are some of the many circumstances in which you see Commission Corps officers. But, they are often invisible. We talk about them as one of the best kept secrets in the U.S. government. Personally, I don't think they should be a secret. I think they should actually be much more out there and visible. And that's something as leadership we've got to do a better job on. But they are a critical part of our health infrastructure in the country.
If we take a closer look at the Ebola crisis for a second, what was the term you used? The Monrovian, I'm blanking, Task Force Monrovian?
The Monrovia Medical Unit.
There we go. Medical unit. What was it like making that happen? Was that difficult to create this tip of the spear / vanguard to go to Liberia? Was that challenging to navigate sort of inside the machine of the United States government, or was that relatively straightforward or somewhere in between? What was that experience like for you?
Well, it was a very complicated experience. And it was an experience and an endeavor that was begun shortly before I entered office and that continued long after I got there. But it was not easy for us to pull together because it required a fair amount of legal work to make sure that we had the authorities to go abroad and to set up a medical unit like that. That was one piece of it. Second is we had to think deeply about how to make sure that these officers who had not been deployed to West Africa before